Hey budget gardeners, Vita Loki here. Join me today as we winter sow some Baptisia seeds. So let's go. Baptisia, also known as False Indigo, is a hardy perennial here where I live in USDA Zone 5B. My plan for today's video is not only to winter sow the seeds and show you my process for doing it, I'm also going to be answering a whole bunch of questions that you've asked me regarding the winter sowing process. Some of the questions will be answered in the beginning of the video, other questions will be answered in the end of the video, so please stick around. I have many other videos on my channel having to do with the winter sowing process. If you haven't checked them out, what I'll do is put a link to the playlist down below as well as up above. Even though we've been starting seeds for decades and decades, and the whole idea is not new to us, this whole concept of winter sowing is quite interesting. And a lot of information that I found out about the process, I've learned from a woman named Trudy Davidoff. She, as well as a number of people, have a wonderful resource that's out on Facebook. And what I'll do is put a link to that group down below. It's free to join, and I constantly go out there reading information. In fact, if you go there and click on this one link called Guides, which is at the top, under the guide link, there is so much great information out there having to do with the winter sowing process. There are so many different ways to winter sow seeds. And not only that, there are so many different times you can winter sow seeds. Some people sow the seeds in the winter. Other people do spring sowing or summer sowing. I generally like to just stick with winter sowing inside of my milk jugs, but I know that there are a lot of other ways you can do the same process. Remember, this is meant to be a fun and free way of starting seeds. It's not a set it and forget it process. It requires a little bit of work, but it's so worth it in the end. So let's start with the first question. You've inspired me to try winter sowing this year here in Maine. I hope I'm not too late. I heard you say that you don't winter sow vegetables, but I was hoping that perhaps I could do vegetables and a few perennials. Do you know which veggies would be the best to try? And that's correct. I generally like to just use winter sowing for my perennial seeds. That doesn't mean I don't do any annual seeds in my winter sown containers. I just don't do as many because honestly, I prefer to use my indoor grow lights for my annual flowers and annual vegetables. Part of the reason for that is many perennials need a cold period of time. And when I sow the seeds and put the containers outside, those seeds are getting that natural cold period that they need. But by all means, you can definitely sow annual flowers or annual vegetables using the winter sowing process as well. The thing you want to keep in mind when you're winter sowing vegetable seeds is the seed itself and how many days it has until maturity. So where I live here in New Hampshire, Zone 5B, my growing season is not very long. It's quite short, actually. I'll pop up on the screen my average last frost date and my average first frost date, and that's based on my zip code. And I can find a lot of this information out on the internet, and based on that, I'm going to put up on the screen how many days my growing season is. So knowing that information, I would want to consider the vegetable seeds that I want to start. I would look at the seed packet, and I would look at how long it takes from transplant until maturity. And if it takes a long time, then it makes more sense for me to start that seed indoors. And some great examples would be something like, let's say, a hot pepper plant. Hot pepper plant seeds don't typically germinate until the soil temperature is nice and warm. So when you think about it, if I took some hot pepper seeds and I winter sowed them, let's say I did them today, they are not going to germinate until the soil temperature is the correct soil temperature for hot pepper seeds to germinate. And then eventually the seeds will germinate. The plants will be very, very small. And once those plants have their first set of true leaves, or once the plants are 1 or 2 inches tall, whichever comes first, at that point I can take that plant and transplant it in my landscape. And that date when I transplant that seedling in my landscape is basically day 1. And remember, we talked earlier about days to maturity. So based on the days to maturity, you can see that that plant is going to take a very long time to be a nice mature plant and produce fruit for me. And that's why I definitely will never be winter sowing hot pepper seeds, because it just doesn't make sense for me in my area. But there are so many vegetables that you can winter sow. You can do any of the ones that prefer cool weather, like lettuce, Swiss chard. You can even do tomatoes. I've never done tomatoes, but I've heard people have done it. The biggest advice I can give you is experiment. Don't put too many seeds in your milk jug if you're going to be doing vegetable seeds. Just do enough that you can use for yourself, maybe a little bit extra, and see how it goes. When it comes to winter sowing, the best time to start your winter sowing process is anytime after the winter solstice. You also want to wait until your nighttime temperatures are consistently below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, I started the process a little earlier this year because my nighttime temperatures have definitely been below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. And all the seeds that I winter sowed earlier this year were just hardy perennial seeds, so I feel comfortable having started them a little earlier. Certain vegetable and annual flower seeds will take off super fast. When it comes to perennial seeds, my experience has been they are much slower to take off. They're very small initially, and sometimes some people can get turned off by that, but I can assure you it is so well worth it. Just think about how expensive perennial plants can be when you buy just one plant. And when you start a bunch of seeds, you can end up with a whole bunch of perennial plants that way. Those perennial plants may or may not bloom that first year, but that's okay. Remember the saying, perennial plants sleep, creep, and then leap. Part of gardening on a budget is having a lot of patience. Now I'm going to answer another question. Awesome video and information, Vita. I have some blue globe thistle plants I want to propagate. After using your techniques to start them from seeds in your containers, when do you usually transplant them into your garden? I live in southern Colorado, zone 5B also. Almost 300 days of sunshine here. Would you transplant them in late May sometime? Thanks again for your videos and expertise. Based on the seeds that you've sown, as well as your conditions where you live, different seeds are going to germinate at different times, and they'll germinate when the conditions are right for those particular seeds. The best time to transplant your seedlings is you want to wait until your average last frost date has passed. You also want to wait until the seedlings are about 1 to 2 inches in height, or after they have their first set of what are called true leaves. The first set of leaves that you see on a plant are called the cotyledon leaves. The second set are called true leaves. That's the best time to get those seedlings out in the landscape. It's better to do that process on a rainy or cloudy day. You don't want to do it on a very hot, a very sunny day, because that will put a lot of stress on your seedling. Also, at that time, I like to start fertilizing my seedlings with half a strength of diluted fertilizer. If it's a flower, I like to use Miracle Grow, but you can use whatever you like. And if it's a vegetable plant, I like to use Espoma Grow. I still have a lot of questions I'm going to answer for you during this video, but I do want to get started with the winter sowing process, so let's begin. Even though I like to use milk jugs, you can use whatever container you like. Just make sure that it's translucent or clear. If you ask local coffee shops, they may be able to hold containers like this aside for you. Also, sometimes the local transfer stations might have an area where you can collect them. Whatever container you use, you want to make sure it can hold at least 4 inches of soil. And a few reasons are because you don't want the soil to dry out so quickly. Also, you want it to be able to accommodate the root system for the seedlings that will eventually be in here. So I just have a ruler here that shows you that this is about 4 inches, and I'm just going to mark the spot where we're going to be cutting. Any container that's used for winter sowing should have holes in the top of it. That will allow rain or snow to come into the holes. For the milk container, all you need to do is remove the cover and throw it away. In previous years, I've added additional holes in the top, but I've found that it really doesn't make a difference. Now I don't do that anymore. I like to use something a little more heavy duty for cutting. These are cutting shears or tin snips. You can even use regular scissors or box cutters, but I've found that this makes it a lot easier for me to cut. Whatever container you use should have drainage holes in the bottom of it. The larger your container, the more drainage holes it will have in it. I prefer to cut the drainage holes out first before I cut the container. I just find that the container is a little bit sturdier, so cutting these holes is a lot easier. Some other tools that I've seen people use to cut the bottom of their container include a drill bit, a soldering iron, or even the tip of a hot glue gun. The key is you just want to be safe and you don't want to be inhaling anything if it makes any sort of a smell. So now we're going to go ahead and cut our container. I'm not going to cut all the way across. I'm going to stop on either side of this handle. And the reason is I want to be able to use the handle to open and close my milk jug, and I want to use this section right here as a hinge for my mini greenhouse. And now my mini greenhouse is done. I want you to see that I can open it up eventually when the seedlings are in there and it's a very hot, very sunny day. But if the nighttime temperatures are going to go below freezing, I definitely want to seal back my mini greenhouse. Now time to fill up my container. I'll be using used potting mix that I had in my summer containers. In the past, I've also made my own potting mix. I'll put a link to the DIY potting mix video down below. You can also use brand new potting mix. You don't want to use seed starting mix because it will dry out too quickly. You also don't want to use very heavy garden soil because it may not drain well for you. Whatever potting mix you use, just make sure that it's been pre-moistened. After you've filled your container, you want to press it down lightly to remove any air pockets. Here are the seeds that we're going to be sowing today. These are seeds that I collected myself. I'll put a link to a video down below that shows how to collect your own seeds from a false indigo plant. And if you're looking for a reputable seed company that sells Baptisia seeds, I'll put a link to one or two below. I'll be sowing the seeds about a 1/4 inch deep, and I'm just going to use the back of this marker to make my holes. It doesn't need to be exact, it just needs to be approximate. And I'm spacing out each of these holes because I want to make sure I'm leaving a little bit of room for each of the seedlings. Baptisia seedlings don't like to have their roots disturbed, but I will share that in previous years, I have sown Baptisia seedlings much thicker than this, and I have disturbed their roots, and the plants were perfectly fine. So I don't want you to get too hung up or too worried about that either. The other thing I want to share is if you look up Baptisia seeds and how deep to sow them, many sites will say a 1/4 inch deep. But I have found that these seeds will drop themselves in nature. No one's out there covering them up, and they will germinate just fine. So it's important to just know that as well. When I was researching about Baptisia seeds, I saw that they don't need a very long cold stratification period. I'm almost positive I saw that they only need about a 10-day cold stratification period. With us winter sowing them right now, they're going to get much longer than 10 days, and that is totally fine. It's always important to look up the hardy perennial seed that you're trying to sow because you want to know how long of a cold period that seed needs in order to germinate. And now I can go ahead and just cover up each of these holes. The other thing I want to share is the seeds have a very hard shell or a very hard coat. They're almost similar to a lupin seed or even a sweet pea seed. If you're starting these type of seeds indoors, you may need to scarify them, which means nick the seed. The beauty of winter sowing is you don't actually need to do any of that. That is true with lupin seeds, with nasturtium seeds, many other seeds that have that hard coat. You don't need to nick the seed. You can go ahead and sow them and they will totally be fine. We're going to be adding a label on the inside of our container, and the reason is the label on the outside of the container, for whatever reason, can get worn off or lost. So it's always good to have a backup with a label on the inside. And I'm using a garden marker to do the labeling. I've found that this doesn't wear off as much outside in the elements. You can also use some sort of oil-based marker, pencil, or pen. I have a number of these tags on hand and I'm just trying to use them up. You don't need to buy anything special. You can reuse something that you already have, like used Venetian blinds. Or if you have a bunch of plastic knives that you don't use, you can always use those. Another option is to take used yogurt containers, cut them in strips, and put those as labels. Even though the potting mix is pre-moistened, we're going to go ahead and spray the top as well. I like this small little hand water sprayer. You don't need to go out and buy anything special. This just comes in really handy for me when I'm working on plants indoors. We covered these seeds with potting mix, but if you were winter sowing any sort of seed that needs light to germinate and you had the seeds on top, then you want to make sure you're using a very gentle spray. You don't want to dislodge the seeds. I'm just going to go ahead and wipe the outside of my container. Since we sprayed it, it's wet, and when I put the tape around it, I want the tape to stick. I've been using duct tape for a number of years to seal my containers. I've heard a lot of people have been using painter's tape, and I might end up using that in the future, but you can see I still have a lot of duct tape to go through. One of the benefits I've heard for using painter's tape is it's a lot easier to remove off of your containers, whereas duct tape can be a little bit hard to remove. And I've also heard that both duct tape as well as painter's tape both adhere or stick to the container perfectly fine. But you don't have to use tape. Other people have punched holes in the top and the bottom, and then they've secured the top to the bottom using something like twist ties or zip ties. And then there are other people that like to cut all the way around so that the top is not connected to the bottom, and they nest the top into the bottom. Personally, I don't think I would like that method because I like being able to easily open and close my container, as well as use the handle to move my container around if I need to. And now I'm just going to add the tape to my container. I used to put tape all the way around my container, and I've found that I don't need to do that when I'm winter sowing my hardy perennial seeds. My feeling is hardy perennials can take a frost or even a freeze after they've germinated, so I feel comfortable doing it this way. And to be honest with you, I'm almost sure that my perennials don't even germinate anyway until the frost and freeze window has passed. However, if I was going to be winter sowing a tender plant, like a tender flower or a tender vegetable plant, then in that case, I would be putting the tape all the way around, because then it would add a little bit extra insulation and protection for any of the seedlings that may germinate in here. And don't forget to press down on your tape. You want the tape to be nice and secure on your container. I'm going to label the outside of my container with the name of the seed that we just planted, which is False Indigo. You don't need to put the full name on there if you don't want to. Some people just put numbers, like number 1, and then they have a piece of paper and they label number 1 equals False Indigo. Then the next container they do would be number 2 on the tape. And then on the piece of paper would be the name of the plant. Number 2 equals coneflower, and so on. I also like to add the label on both sides, just because when I'm out in my yard and I have a number of containers, I want to be able to very quickly see what's inside of each of the containers. But you definitely don't need to label it on both sides if you don't want to. Back in the day, I used to label my containers up here, but I found that I can actually reuse my containers for at least 2 seasons. So now I've started only labeling on the tape itself. Okay, so here we are outside. It's about a balmy 15 degrees Fahrenheit right now. I wanted to bring you out here just to show you where I'm placing my containers. You don't want them under any sort of eaves, under a roof. You don't want them in a greenhouse structure. You want them out in the open so that snow or rain can come into those holes. If you live in an area that's very windy, you want to make sure that your containers are secured. Some people will take their milk jugs or their containers of choice and they'll put them inside of a larger container, like let's say a tote. If you're going to do that, make sure that that secondary container, let's say tote, has holes inside the bottom of it, because you need the water to be able to drain from that container. You'll notice that my containers are covered in snow. You do not need snow in order to do the winter sowing process. Now my containers are going to freeze and they're going to stay frozen for a number of months. That means I don't need to add any additional water into the containers. It might not snow, it might not rain for 2 or 3 weeks, but if these containers are frozen, there is no use in adding water to them. But where you live, your containers may not be frozen. So it's important to be checking on your containers and adding water into them if they're getting dry. And the best way to tell if they're dry is to pick them up. If they feel really, really light, it's time to give them water. And you don't need to open the containers up. You don't want to open the containers up yet. You want to just go ahead and spray water into the top of it. I like to use that mini water bottle like I showed you, but you can use whatever you have. Just add a nice small stream of water into the top of your container. Going back to the wind, if you have a container that topples over or falls over, that's not good, because now snow or rain can't get into the top of it. So make sure you're checking on your containers and righting them up if they've fallen over. Different seeds will germinate at different times, so just be patient. I have a lot more questions that I want to answer, so let's head back inside. I am so thankful for the winter sowing process. It is so cold outside. I can't be out in my garden, but I can be inside gardening. This is the best thing ever, which is why I love sharing these videos with you. Some of these questions that I'm pulling are a little bit older, but I feel like they're still very relevant. And I know that a lot of people haven't seen my answers to these questions, which is why I'm bringing them up now. So the next question is, what type of perennials have you had the best luck with winter sowing for your zone? So I live in USDA zone 5B, and I'm always trying to experiment with lots of different perennials that I can winter sow. I jotted down a list of all the perennials that I was able to successfully winter sow, so let me go through that list. Foxglove, Dianthus, English daisy, lupin, sea holly, columbine, hollyhock, coreopsis, echinacea, rudbeckia, false indigo, Shasta daisy, daylilies, iris, obedient plant, balloon flower, mallow, great blue lobelia, cardinal flower, penstemon, anise hyssop, salvia, bee balm, and primrose. I know I'm missing some more, but that gives you a general idea of some of the plants I've had success winter sowing. Now you might have a perennial that's hardy in your zone that unfortunately is not hardy in my zone, so I can't grow it. So this is where I want to hear from you. Please drop a comment down below. Let me know what zone you live in. And if there was a plant that I didn't mention here that you've successfully winter sown, please let me know what it is, because I'm not the only one that reads these comments. Other people do too. So it's always great for us to learn from each other. And here's the next question. Looks like you've had great success. Thanks for posting this. Not sure if I missed it, but do you winter sow snapdragons and stock? If you do, when did you put them out in your milk jugs in your zone? Does zone matter? I'm in New York 7. In that particular video, I was showing Snapdragon and stock seedlings that I had. And in fact, those were seedlings that I started indoors under my grow lights. However, I have heard of other people having success with winter sowing both of those plants, so definitely give it a try. Remember, you generally want to wait until after the winter solstice and once your nighttime temperatures are consistently below 50 degrees Fahrenheit when you start sowing those seeds. When it comes to zones, growing zones don't matter in terms of winter sowing. The only importance zones has is when it comes to the perennial seeds that you're trying to winter sow and making sure that that perennial is hardy in your growing zone. I've never done it, but I've heard some people have winter sown all of their seeds in one sitting in one day. And you might be wondering, how can that be? How does that work? These seeds just sit there. They're asleep, they're dormant. They can take the freeze. They are perfectly fine. They're not going to germinate until the time is right for that particular seed. And once the time is right, once the temperature conditions have been met, then those seeds will start germinating. It's my understanding that if you live in an area that's much warmer than me and your cold period is much shorter than mine, then it's so important for you to be sowing those hardy perennial seeds earlier on because you want to make sure that those seeds are getting the right cold period that they need. On the flip side, where I live, and we talked a little bit about this earlier, my growing season is much shorter than a lot of other people's growing seasons. So I have to think very carefully about those annual vegetables or annual flowers that have a very long days to maturity. So it doesn't make sense for me to winter sow plants that take a very long time to grow from seed to maturity. But if you live in an area that has a much longer growing season than I do, you might be able to get away with winter sowing a hot pepper seed or winter sowing a begonia or an impatiens seed. I would much rather winter sow annual flowers that from seed to bloom are very quick. I had a bunch more questions I wanted to go over today, but I don't want to make this video too long. I'll save those for the next video. In the meanwhile, please drop a comment down below and ask any other questions that you have having to do with winter sowing. And as I continue making videos where I'm winter sowing a particular seed, I'll be sure to answer questions that you have. And until the next video, make it a great day with gardening.